I always thought I had already stepped out of the darkest chapter of my life. I had endured divorce, bankruptcy, losing my home, and carrying the reputation of a woman abandoned by her husband for unknown reasons. For years, I lived in bitterness, believing I had been betrayed, discarded, treated as a burden a man wanted to escape from. But that afternoon, standing in front of Great Lakes Equity Bank, I realized I knew nothing at all. I saw him. Andre Lomax, the man who used to be my husband, bent over, picking cans out of a trash bin on a wind-bitten street in Cleveland. A torn, tattered coat, hands cracked from cold, hair and beard matted with gray, a gaunt face so hollow I almost didn't recognize him. When I called his name, Andre looked at me with the eyes of someone who did not expect to survive another day, and then he said the sentence that shattered my life like breaking glass. "Sharon, I disappeared so you could live." I froze on the sidewalk, my feet rooted to the cold cement. It wasn't until the sharp clicks of my heels, tock, tock, rang against the pavement that he lifted his head by reflex. And in that moment, our eyes met. Just one brief second, but I saw clearly that he recognized me. Then a wave of memories, sharp and heavy, swept across that sunken face. His hands trembled slightly. He tried to step back, as if my presence was a ghost he never wanted to face, a debt he knew he could never repay. "Andre?" My voice slipped out, shaking so much I barely recognized it myself. "Is that you?" He lowered his head, shame swallowing him whole. "You shouldn't see me like this," he said, his raspy voice dragging like metal across stone. "Forget it. Go. Just go." But I couldn't. I stood there facing him, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I looked closely. His torn shoes, fingers cracked by the cold wind, eyes sunken from hunger and exhaustion. Nothing about this man resembled the Andre I once knew, the respected engineer in crisp suits who spoke passionately about the projects he was leading. "Why are you living like this?" I asked, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. "After everything that happened." "I need to know." He pressed his lips together, glancing around warily, as if someone might be listening. Then he slowly shook his head. "You were never supposed to see me again," he whispered. "I did everything so you wouldn't have to carry this." I stepped closer, close enough to smell the stale sweat, the street dust, the scent of poverty clinging to him like a second skin. "Carry what?" I asked. "What did you do, Andre?" That was when he lifted his face. His eyes were wet, painful, desperate, and he uttered the words that tore my heart apart. "To save you, Sharon. Everything was to save you." Those words didn't just shock me. They opened a door I had locked for years, the door back to a marriage full of unanswered questions, fractures I thought I understood, and a truth I had never even touched. If you think this is just a tearful reunion, the story goes much farther than that. Much, much farther. I could barely breathe. My legs weakened, and I reached out to hold his arm, afraid he might collapse right in front of me. "Save me from what?" I asked, almost pleading. Andre tried to steady himself, but his body was done. 1 second later, he crumpled onto me and fell to the freezing sidewalk like an old tree snapped by a storm. I screamed for help. A few passers-by rushed over. We called an ambulance. While waiting, I knelt beside him, lifting his head onto my lap, just like I used to when we were young and he had a fever. I never imagined I would hold him like this again, fragile, broken, and full of regret. In the ambulance, the paramedics said he was severely dehydrated, profoundly anemic, and showed signs of chronic malnutrition. I heard every word like a verdict on my own life, because the man I once loved had fallen this far. At Cleveland Westview Medical Center, he was taken straight into emergency care. They said he had been seen around the area many times, sleeping in makeshift shelters, refusing aid, carrying no identification. Hours later, when he woke up, I was still sitting beside his bed. "Go," he said the moment he opened his eyes. "My troubles don't belong to you anymore." "You were never not part of my life," I replied, "and I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth." He closed his eyes, torn in a way I had never seen. Finally, he released a long, weary breath. I didn't go bankrupt because of bad decisions. I went bankrupt because I complied. Complied with whom? I asked. He turned toward the wall and stayed silent. And that silence weighed more than any confession. That night, I slept sitting beside his bed, not because I was obligated to, but because I couldn't bring myself to walk away. In the hospital darkness, I remembered everything. The arguments without reason, the day he vanished without a word, the cold legal papers, and the financial collapse that nearly ruined me. I used to think I understood, but I understood nothing. At dawn, dim light filtered through the hospital curtains. He opened his eyes and looked at me for a long time with a sorrow that suffocated the air. "Everything I lost so you could live," he whispered. "Yet in the end, you still hated me." A lump rose in my throat. "I didn't know anything," I said. "I thought you betrayed me." A single tear slid down his cheek, slow, heavy. "That's exactly what I needed you to believe." In that moment, I understood that all those years I had been guided by a lie crafted too perfectly, that his suffering wasn't the result of failure, but of a hidden sacrifice. I didn't yet know who was behind it all, or what danger had once loomed over us. But one thing ignited inside me. I had to uncover the truth. I held his hand gently. "Rest, Andre. This time, you're not alone." As he closed his eyes under the harsh white hospital lights, I knew. That meeting among trash cans, scraps, and a fallen man was no coincidence. It was the beginning of a truth powerful enough to shatter lives and change mine forever. Andre slept almost the entire next day, partly because of the pain medication, partly because of years of exhaustion and neglect. I sat by his side, not even sure for what specific reason, just with a very clear feeling. If I walked out of this room, I would lose something important, something that had once slipped out of my hands in the darkness of the past. As I watched him breathing heavily in the hospital bed, old memories started to flood back without warning, like water surging through a dam that had long since rotted. I met him when I was 28. He was a man of big plans, bold promises, and strong hands that always knew how to build something useful. He worked day and night, but always managed to find a moment to look at me as if I were the most beautiful achievement of his life. He promised me a stable home, trips away, a future I could lean on. And for many years, he kept his word. We weren't wealthy, but we were content in the simplest way. I sewed, kept house, and counted every dollar to make it stretch. He built, repaired, and went on dreaming his own dreams. Our marriage wasn't completely smooth. There were still arguments, long silences, and small wounds that never fully healed. But I never imagined the ending would come like it did. Cold, without shouting, without explanation, without any warning at all. One morning he simply didn't come home from work. 2 days passed with no sign of him. I went to the police station, to the hospital, to his office. No one knew anything. No one had seen him. On the third day, a lawyer showed up at my door with a sealed envelope. Inside was a hastily written note in his own handwriting. "I'm sorry. This is for the best. Don't look for me." That day my world began to shatter from the inside without a sound. For weeks I called him, texted him. The phone number no longer existed. Every attempt at contact felt like throwing messages into a void. Then the next blows fell. Debts I had never known about, empty bank accounts, property being seized, legal notices arriving in waves like a toxic rain. In less than 6 months, I lost everything. My husband, my stability, my home. I had to move into a tiny room and start over at 47. Some people looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. Some even blamed me. "You must have done something to make your husband leave." I let them talk, because even I didn't understand what had happened. For years, I hated Andre. I hated him for leaving me without a word of explanation. I hated him for letting me bear the weight of debts, shame, and the world's doubts. I hated him for disappearing as if our life together had just been a mistake that needed to be erased. But that night, sitting by his hospital bed, The first crack appeared in that boulder of hatred. When Andre woke up, I asked the nurse to give us privacy and close the door. He looked at me with absolute exhaustion. Those eyes were no longer the eyes I once knew. They had been damaged by something deeper than poverty. "Tell me everything," I said. "Don't lie anymore. It doesn't mean anything now." He was silent for a long time. His breathing was heavy, as if his chest was filled with stones. At last he spoke. "The day I disappeared, that very day, I received the order to die." My chest tightened as if someone had clamped it in a vice. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. "Because that's what they ordered me to do," he replied. "And I chose something else." "Who ordered you?" I asked. He swallowed, as if forcing down the weight of his entire past. "Dangerous people, Sharon. Extremely dangerous people." It wasn't the kind of truth that explodes loudly. It was the kind that sits on your heart like a slab of stone. I was accused of fraud, a project where I had only signed the paperwork because I was forced to. When I tried to report it, they showed me fake evidence, paid-off witnesses, and a photo of you stepping out of our apartment building. A chill ran straight down my spine. They told me that if I opened my mouth, if I tried to defend my name, you would pay the price. I could barely stay standing under those words. "And you ran?" I asked, my voice as small as a breath. "I didn't run. I erased myself." He told me he had taken the blame for everything, signed whatever they demanded, handed over all his assets, let the accounts be drained, so that the story of his collapse would look real enough that no one would question it, so they would stop coming for me. "You had to hate me," he said hoarsely. "That was the only way for you to stop asking questions." I cried in silence, clenching my hands so I wouldn't sob out loud. "All those years of suffering were to protect me?" I asked. "To save your life." I covered my mouth with my hand, feeling 40 years of resentment collapse in a single breath, leaving only a painful emptiness. "And why did you never come back?" I asked. "Because they were watching. Every time I tried to get close, someone would remind me that you were still alive, only because I kept obeying." In that moment, I understood. His ruin hadn't been a consequence. It had been a condition forced upon him. If right now you feel like this story has already hit rock bottom, trust me, we've only just stepped through the first door. What waits behind it is not just the truth, but a web of power strong enough to crush 2 lives, and possibly more. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked up and down the hospital corridor aimlessly, my mind filled with new pieces clicking into place, rewriting my entire history, both my resentment and my brokenness. Everything, it turned out, had only been pieces of a sophisticated control campaign. The next morning, I came back to Andre's bedside with a different resolve. "I can't pretend I didn't hear any of this," I said. "I'm not the fearful woman I used to be." Andre looked at me, deeply worried. "Don't dig up the past, Sharon. The past kills people." "Silence does too," I replied. "And I've been silent for far too long." He tried to sit up, panic in his voice. If you talk, they'll come." "Let them," I said plainly. "This time you won't be alone." In his eyes, I saw fear, not for himself, but for me. "You don't know who you're playing with," he whispered. "And you don't know how many years of my life you took away with your silence," I replied. He pressed his lips together, tears falling without a sound. That day, strangers started appearing in the hospital. They didn't look like relatives of any patient. They asked about beds that didn't exist. They stood in places no one usually stood. They watched. Andre gripped my hand tightly, desperate. It started. I looked at him, strangely calm, the calm of someone who has lost too much to still be afraid. Then this is also the moment the final part of the story begins. If you became a ghost to save me, then now I will be the one to bring you back to life and make the people who destroyed you pay for it. The hospital room was swallowed in a dim half-darkness when I returned after a long day of phone calls, meetings, and enduring those heavy silences at the other end of the line. Andre slept fitfully. His chest rose and fell with difficulty, as if every breath had to drag along an invisible weight. Outside the window, the night was quiet in an unnatural way, as if the entire city had no idea something was about to explode. When Andre opened his eyes, he looked at me with a gaze that mixed gratitude and guilt. "They've started to move, haven't they?" he whispered. "Yes," I replied. "They know someone is holding documents." He closed his eyes again, exhausted. "Then there's not going to be any easy way out of this." "There never was an easy way out," I said. "But now, for the first time, you're not fighting them alone." We were silent for a few seconds. Then I leaned toward him. "There's something you still haven't told me, Andre. I know it. I see it in your eyes, and I need to hear everything right now." His face tightened. For the first time since I'd found him, I saw real terror in his eyes. "That's the one thing I was never supposed to tell you," he whispered, "because once you know, there's no turning back for you." "I haven't had a way back since the moment I saw you picking cans off the street," I replied. "Say it." He stayed quiet for several heavy seconds. Finally, with a broken voice, Andre released the words that sent a chill through my entire body. "If I say it, if I say the full names, they'll kill you." The shock hit like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath out of me. "Just like that?" I whispered. "Just like that," he confirmed. "They're not just some corrupt businessmen. Among them are people from the state, officials, judges who've been bought off, men who make files disappear, and people who exist only in the shadows." A shiver ran down my spine. I understood that this was far bigger than I had imagined. It was no longer just about money. This was raw power. "That's why I agreed to fall," he continued. "Because when they put your picture on the table and said everything could be staged as a robbery, an accident, I knew I wasn't negotiating for my life anymore. I was negotiating for yours." My eyes burned, tears spilling over. "And I hated you all those years," I said. "I buried you alive in my heart." "That's what kept me alive," he replied. "Knowing that as long as you still hated me, you were still safe." I covered my face with my hands. The past was being rewritten in me with violent blows, every memory of rage now twisted, turning into a warped, extreme, agonizing form of love. "Tell me their names," I insisted, "even if they kill me tomorrow." He shook his head. "First, we have to secure the evidence. The box alone isn't enough. They can erase traces, stage a fire, an attack, an accident. We need the truth to be put out there in a way they can't bury." "How?" "Press, a clean prosecutor, international witnesses, if necessary." I took a deep breath. In that moment, I understood. This was no longer the tragedy of a single family. This was a fight against a rotten structure. "Then tell me about them," I said, "even if you don't say their names yet." Andre closed his eyes and began to lay it out in pieces. A network of companies, rigged contracts, millions of dollars diverted, construction projects left unfinished forever, officials signing off in exchange for thick envelopes, lawyers hired only to shut up anyone who dared oppose them. He told me about an accountant ruled a suicide, about an engineer forced into hiding after a false accusation, about a councilman who died in a family accident that looked random. "They all knew too much," Andre whispered. "Just like me." He paused and looked at me in pain. "And you knew nothing, but you were the bargaining chip." If at this point you think my greatest pain was being abandoned by my husband without an explanation, that was only the first mask. The rest of the story will show you this. Sometimes, people don't just steal your money or your honor. They steal your entire life, and then use your very name as a shield for their crimes. That night, I left the hospital with a heavy knot lodged in my chest. I walked along the sidewalk, seeing every unfamiliar face as a potential enemy. For the first time, I felt real fear, physical fear, no longer something that lived only in emotion. But even so, I did not stop. The next day, with the help of an old journalist who had spent years investigating big cases, I began to pull strings with extreme caution. Callista Owens, a black woman around 70, with short silver hair and eyes as sharp as a razor blade. She had written about urban corruption in Cleveland for 3 decades. We met in a small cafe near Westside Market, far from the hospital, far from my home, far from anything that could link us together. I showed her only a very small portion of the documents, just enough for her to understand this was real and very big. "If everything in here is true," she said, her face turning pale, "there will be more than one person who wants you dead." "They've wanted that for a long time," I replied. "I just never knew." That afternoon, I went back to the hospital to tell Andre that the process had begun. He looked paler than ever. The illness was quietly eating away at him at a ruthless pace. "So there's no turning back," he whispered. "There never was," I replied. That night, while the city slept, the first direct hit arrived. Callista called me, her voice trying to stay steady, but I could hear the shock beneath it. "They tore apart my office," she said. "They didn't take anything of value, just the files, and someone left a piece of paper on my desk." I swallowed hard. "What did it say?" "We only warn once." An old familiar chill slid down my spine. I knew very well they were tracking our every move. Right then, I decided we had to move everything to a place no one would think to look. But first, I needed to retrieve the box. Andre had told me about it in a moment of weakness. Under the old plant where I used to work. No one else knows about it. Inside are the original documents proving the embezzlement. Lakefront Steelworks and Machinery Yard. A steel plant and machinery yard in North Cleveland, near the shore of Lake Erie. It had long been abandoned, nothing left but rusting steel frames and shattered glass scattered on the ground. I went there on a gray autumn afternoon. The wind from Lake Erie whipped across my face, carrying the smell of rusted metal and old oil. I stepped inside carefully, my heart pounding heavy beats. I searched for the false shelf, moved some crates, ran my hands along the wall until I found an uneven gap. I dug with a rusty tool left in the corner of the plant. My hands trembled when they touched the buried metal box. I pulled it from the ground with all my strength. It was heavy. I opened the lock exactly the way Andre had described. Inside were sealed folders, USB drives, contracts with real signatures, photos, recordings, enough to bring down more than one powerful name. I was horrified and determined at the same time. It was no longer just about knowing the truth. At that moment, I was holding the truth in my hands. As I left the plant, I saw a car parked half a block away start its engine immediately. I walked straight ahead without looking back until I reached a busy corner and stepped into a store. I stood there, waiting, watching. The car circled around, then finally disappeared from sight. This game was no longer a secret game. I returned to the hospital with the metal box hidden in an ordinary shopping bag. Andre was awake, waiting for me. Just from the look on my face, he knew I had done it. I didn't say a word, just gave a slight nod. "Now they're not just chasing you and me," he said, his voice drained. "Now they're chasing the truth." "Let them try," I replied. "This time, I don't intend to hide it." In that moment, I knew I had crossed an invisible line. I was no longer just the woman who cried when she saw her ex-husband picking cans. Now I was the one holding a truth that could topple an empire. And the people who had played God with our lives for all those years were no longer the only ones who knew their own secrets. That night, alone in a small room no one paid attention to, I opened the box. I read every document, traced the timelines. I saw names I'd heard on the news, names tied to major corporations, to politicians, to respectable men. Then I saw it, my name, Sharon Delacroix, appearing in multiple files, documents where I was listed as the debtor of unimaginable sums, contracts where my name was attached to shell companies I had never heard of, forged signatures, bank accounts opened in my name that I had never touched. All of it constructed so that if anyone ever investigated, everything would point to me as the guilty one. A wave of dizziness forced me to close my eyes for a few seconds just to stay upright. "All of this came crashing down on me after you left," I whispered when I returned to Andre's room. "The debts, the seizures. I thought it was bad luck, the consequence of you abandoning me." "Not abandonment," he said, his voice breaking. "It was sacrifice, and even then, it still wasn't enough to protect you completely." Images rose up, dragging along memories I thought had rotted away. The day I was thrown out of my home and no one dared look me in the eye. The court notice that wiped out what little savings I had. The humiliation of having to borrow money from relatives who had once admired me. The sleepless nights trying to understand how I owed something I had never signed for. The long years I became a burden in everyone's eyes. "I went to clean houses," I said, my throat burning. At 50, I was hungry. I slept on borrowed couches, and in the meantime, they used my name to launder money. I crushed a document in my hand until it wrinkled between my fingers. "Why didn't you warn me, Andre?" I asked, tears spilling over. "Even if they killed me, at least, I would die knowing the truth." "No," he said desperately, "because I still had one last card to bargain with for your life. You didn't know. But every time someone wondered why I was still staying quiet, all I had to do was show them a picture of you, as a reminder of why I still had to obey." My tears fell onto the pile of papers. "So even my misery was part of the show," I said. "Yes," he nodded. "So people would believe that you and I were completely destroyed, so no one would think they needed to dig any deeper." The next day, thanks to Callista, I was introduced to a young, passionate prosecutor, Assistant State Attorney Deshaun Miles, a black man of about 38, with a stern face and sharp, cold eyes. He had handled many small corruption cases before, but he had never touched anything this big. We met in his office after dark. Deshaun sat down, opened the file I had brought, and went through each name, each number, each contract. "If all of this is real," he said, frowning, "we're talking about a network that's been operating for over 20 years. "It is real," I replied. "My entire life was destroyed to cover it up." He looked up, staring straight into my eyes with a seriousness I knew I would never forget. "In that case, you're not just seeking justice for yourself," he said slowly. "You're about to go after some very powerful people." "They went after me first," I answered. Deshaun nodded, not arguing. "I'll protect these files as if they belonged to my own family," he said. I walked out of the building still shaking, not exactly from fear, but from a sense of overwhelm, as if I had stepped to the very edge of a deep chasm whose bottom I could not see. But the enemy did not sleep. 2 nights later, when I returned to my small rented house, I found the door slightly ajar. Every instinct in me screamed. I pushed the door open. Everything had been turned upside down, drawers yanked out, cabinets open, picture frames thrown on the floor. Nothing of value was taken. No money, no electronics, nothing at all, except for one thing: my old wedding album. The message was painfully clear. "We know who you are. We know who you love." The next morning, at first light, I held Andre in the hospital without saying a word. Just from my face, he understood. "Now they'll go for the softest spot," he whispered. "They've been hitting that for a long time," I replied. "There's nothing left that can break me the way it used to." But I knew I was lying, because the fear of losing him could still crush me at any moment. A few days later, the blow that nearly destroyed us completely came down. Andre's condition suddenly worsened. He spiked a high fever, struggled to breathe, his lungs weakening. They rushed him into intensive care. The attending physician spoke to me with that cold tone I had grown far too familiar with. "If he makes it through the next 48 hours, he'll have a chance." That night, I sat outside the ICU, eyes fixed on a lifeless white wall. I thought maybe he would never live to see the guilty fall. Maybe his sacrifice would remain forever unfinished. guilt pressed against my chest like an iron anvil. At dawn, my phone rang. Deshawn. "We're going to execute the first raids today," he said. My heart skipped a beat. This soon? If we wait any longer, they'll have time to wipe everything. They've already started. The next few hours felt like a slow-motion nightmare. Fragmented updates, short calls, coordinated operations, offices being searched, servers seized, respectable businessmen summoned overnight. By mid-afternoon, Callista sent me a single text. "This is about to blow." And it did. If you think this is the climax already, it isn't. What happens next will show you that sometimes justice does not walk slowly down courthouse hallways. It hurtles in between ambulances, threats, and accidents that almost cost lives. Don't walk away from this story, because from here on out, every decision could cost someone their life. The first public victims of the network began to fall that very night. A corporate chairman detained, a manager on the run, a former official thrown out by his own party as a sacrificial lamb to save face. Elias Bradford, the chairman of the largest construction conglomerate in Cleveland, appeared on every news channel. His face was pale, a trembling hand covering half of it, his wrists locked in gleaming cuffs. Council President Marvin Duquesne, the powerful president of the city council, a man no one had dared touch before, was now having to answer for his role in burying documents and forcing Andre to take the blame. The entire country began to buzz, but the enemy struck back. Once, as I was leaving the hospital, a man walked up to me, pretending to bump into me, then shoved me slightly off course toward the street, just as a car sped by at a speed far too perfect to be called accidental. A medic saw what was happening, tripped at just the right moment, and bumped into me, sending me falling backwards. The car shot past, grazing my knee by inches before disappearing into traffic. I understood very clearly. I no longer had any margin for error. That night, I sat by Andre's bed again. He was still unconscious. I spoke to him as if he could hear every word. "They can't hide it anymore. Everything is starting to fall apart. Don't you dare give up now." A single tear slipped quietly onto his hand. At dawn the next morning, he opened his eyes. His lips were dry, his voice just a thin breath. "Are they still walking free?" "Very much alive, and very panicked," I replied. He tried to smile. "Then, it's worth it." I squeezed his hand. "This isn't over." 2 days later, Deshawn called me urgently to his office. I walked in with my heart pounding. "We have enough evidence to go to trial," he said. "Names, money trails, recordings, everything. And the ones at the top." He paused for a moment on the words, "the ones at the top." I felt my knees nearly give way. "So it's now or never." "Exactly," he nodded. As I left the building, I knew the story that had begun among trash bags and aluminum cans on the street was moving toward the point of no return. We were no longer just two victims. We were the crack through which an entire empire was starting to collapse. That night, I told Andre everything. "They will fall," I whispered into his ear. "All of them." He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, a peace I had never seen before passed over his face. "Then, when the time comes, I can go in peace," he said softly. "Don't talk like that," I almost begged. "Someone has to pay for the years a righteous man was forced into silence." "I know," he replied, his voice like a fading breeze. "But someone also has to pay for the sacrifices that were never named." In that moment, I realized that the box of documents wouldn't just change the history of a city, or even of a country. It had changed the fate of one man, a man who had accepted losing everything just so I could keep breathing. And now, for the first time in decades, his truth was about to be written down in words that no one could erase. The first name appeared on the morning news on Tuesday, just as dawn was spilling through the hospital window. I was sitting beside Andre when the anchor, with a deep, grave voice, read aloud a name the entire city knew: Elias Bradford. His face appeared on the screen, ashen, a trembling hand covering half of it, his wrists tightly cuffed. A shiver ran down my spine. Not joy, overwhelm. The truth had just stepped out of the shadows and into the light. "It's begun," I whispered. Andre opened his eyes weakly and looked at the screen. "I never thought I'd live to see this day." That day, the second and then the third man fell. Raids were carried out in different parts of the city. Servers were confiscated, offices sealed off with yellow tape. The network Andre had once described in a shaking voice from his hospital bed was unraveling knot by knot before the entire public. Men who used to stand at podiums of honor now walked past television cameras with bowed heads. But nothing about it was smooth or neat. Each time one of them fell, a new counterstrike came. Anonymous calls to the hospital, strange figures lingering too long near Andre's door, a note stuffed under his wheelchair with just 3 words. "This isn't over." 2 days later, Deshawn called me to his office immediately. "We need your official testimony," he said. Not as his ex-wife, but as the person holding the original documents. I felt a crushing weight slam down onto my shoulders. "Is it safe?" "At this point, nothing is safe," Deshawn answered bluntly. "But without your testimony, there will still be people who manage to slip through." I nodded. There was no way back. At this point, if anyone thinks justice is simply about submitting evidence and letting the court handle the rest, they've never seen a 67-year-old woman walk into a courtroom to face the people who destroyed her life. What comes next is the moment every mask falls, and not all of them fall quietly. On the day I gave my testimony, the courthouse was packed with reporters. As I walked in, I felt every gaze hitting me like arrows. I, the woman who had lived nearly 2 decades in quiet obscurity, was now the central witness in an investigation shaking half the country. In the courtroom, there they were. The faces that had appeared on billboards, charity events, political fundraisers. Some were still in immaculate suits, as if dignity could protect them. Others were already falling apart, their color drained. I recognized 2 of the names Andre had whispered to me in the hospital. A cold sensation crept across my hands, but I did not stop walking. Deshawn began, calling names, dates, money flows, contracts. Then he called me to the witness stand. "Do you recognize these documents?" He handed me a set of files so familiar it hurt. "Yes," I replied. "For years I thought they were the reason I lost everything. Today I know. They are the mechanism of their crimes." A murmur rippled across the room. "Can you tell us how they came into your possession?" I took a deep breath and told everything. The old plant, the box buried under the floor, Andre's confession, the threats, the surveillance, the desperate attempts to flee. I held nothing back. Each sentence fell like a hammer blow on the men who had used power to crush other people's lives. One of them suddenly jumped to his feet, face flushed, pointing straight at me. "She's lying. She's being manipulated by a criminal. Silence!" The judge's gavel slammed down. He looked around the room and then spoke slowly, distinctly. "This woman is the reason we are here today, and you gentlemen are the reason her life was once marked by ruin." I could no longer stand steady. Deshawn reached out and helped guide me back to my seat. When the hearing ended, there was no doubt left. The evidence was overwhelming. Some arrest warrants were signed that very day. Some tried to negotiate. Some shouted that they were the victims. 2 of them requested protection, afraid of retaliation. The fortress of power was collapsing from within. I returned to the hospital with my heart ready to burst. Andre was awake. "Have they fallen?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "They've started to fall." He closed his eyes, and a small smile, so beautiful it hurt, appeared on his lips. "Then I can rest a little." "Don't you dare leave me now." I gripped his hand. "The most important part isn't done yet." "What's left?" "Clearing your name, Andre." 3 days later, the news hit like a bomb. A high-ranking official, someone who for years had been considered untouchable, was arrested at the airport while trying to leave the country on a fake passport. On his computer, they found detailed files of illegal operations. And among them, Andre's name appeared as the designated scapegoat, accompanied by clear instructions that he was to take the blame for those at the very top. Deshawn came to the hospital in person. "Mr. Andre Lomax," he said solemnly, "officially, you are cleared of all charges. Your name has been cleansed before the law." Andre looked at me as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "This means," Deshawn continued, "you were the victim of a large-scale criminal extortion scheme, and your sacrifice helped dismantle one of the most dangerous networks in this country." Andre broke down in tears. I held him, trying not to hurt him. "We did it," I whispered. "After all those years, we finally did it." But justice, like always, never comes free. At dawn the very next day, Andre's condition suddenly deteriorated. Internal bleeding, alarms blaring, medical staff rushing in like a storm. I stood outside the emergency room, both hands pressed to my chest, praying to a God I hadn't dared speak to in years. Hours that felt like a lifetime passed. Finally, the doctor came out. One look at his face was enough. We did everything we could, but his body was too weak. My world split in two. I walked into the room. Andre lay there, connected to every machine imaginable. I took his hand. "You carried the truth all the way to the end," I whispered. "Now everyone knows." Andre opened his eyes one last time. He looked at me with a tenderness I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "Worth it," he said softly, "because you're still alive, and they won't hate you because of me anymore." A tear slid down his cheek. "I never hated you," I said, a gentle lie, so he could leave in peace. Andre drew his final breath with a faint smile on his lips. Andre's death was only a brief headline in the middle of the scandal storm shaking the entire country, but to me, it wasn't news. It was an earthquake. I mourned him in silence. No cameras, no speeches, no one there but me and the truth he had carried his whole life. I sat with that loss, with the years that had been stolen from us and would never be returned. A few days later, when I buried Andre at Rose Hill Cemetery, a graveyard facing the cold, gray surface of Lake Erie, a prosecutor walked up to me. "There will be financial compensation," he said softly, "and a public apology in his case." I looked at him, too exhausted to feel anything at the words financial compensation. "Nothing gives him back the years he lost," I replied. "But maybe it will keep others from losing theirs." That afternoon, I went home alone. I turned on a small lamp, sat down on the bed, and felt all the strength drained from my body. The network had collapsed. The guilty were either arrested or on the run. The truth had been printed on every front page. Justice had come, but the man who had guarded the flame for that justice was gone. Even so, I understood something that shook me. The revenge I had been chasing all this time wasn't about seeing someone go to prison. It was about seeing the truth stand firm. And now, that revenge was complete. In the weeks that followed, I gave up the tiny rented room where I had lived through my hardest years and bought a modest, bright apartment with big windows looking out over West Boulevard Park. I didn't want luxury. I didn't want display. I just wanted a place where I could breathe without trembling. I put only a few necessary things in the apartment: a small table, 2 chairs, a few books, and the old photographs I had saved from the collapse years before. Among them was a wedding picture of Andre and me. I looked at it for a long time. Then I placed it in a simple frame on the cabinet, not to honor the husband who disappeared, but to honor the man who had sacrificed for me without my knowing. I learned to live slowly. I learned to savor mornings with a hot cup of coffee, sunlight filtering through the curtains, the sound of children playing in the square below. For years, I thought the world owed me something. Now I know. The only thing it owes me is peace. People may think that when justice arrives, everything ends. But the truth is different. Justice only closes one door. Your heart still has to learn how to open a new one. And I, at 67, was learning to open that door for the very first time. A month after the case ended, a public ceremony was held. I didn't want to go, but Deshawn insisted. "Not for you," he said. "For history." I agreed. In the large courthouse hall, they read the official statement. They named Andre as a victim of large-scale criminal extortion. They acknowledged that his life had been destroyed to protect the illegal interests of those in power. When they read his full name, I felt my chest crack open all over again. They invited me to step forward. I walked slowly. The entire room watched me, no one saying a word. Deshawn handed me a stack of documents, the final resolution. "On behalf of the state," he said, "we are sorry we came too late." I held that file without knowing what to say. There are no words that are enough for so much loss, and none that are enough for so much closure. That evening, I returned to my new apartment, my heart both tired and light. I opened the window. The breeze moved the curtain gently. I thought of the woman I had been when Andre disappeared. A woman full of anger, full of shame, full of poverty, full of resentment. None of that was meaningless. Every tear, every night without an answer, all of it had led me to the moment of truth today. But the price was too high. That night, I sat by the window and watched life move outside. I listened to the children playing in the park. I felt the late afternoon sunlight. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not afraid. I no longer looked over my shoulder, no longer panicked at every loud noise, no longer questioned every glass of water I picked up. I once thought I had been abandoned. I once thought Andre had destroyed me out of selfishness. I once thought the entire collapse was the result of his cowardice. But in the end, I had been wrong. He was the one who carried the pain for me so I could keep living. He traded his entire life so that I would not have to trade mine. We lost years no one can give back, years of resentment, silence, hunger, humiliation. But today, I understand one thing. My freedom was purchased with his sentence. I do not rejoice at seeing the guilty marched into prison. I do not feel triumphant watching them bow their heads before the cameras. My peace came when the truth was made clear, when his name was cleared, when I finally knew the reason behind it all. He had loved me so much, he destroyed himself to protect me. Now, I live simply, but I live in peace. I sleep soundly. I walk without fear. And every morning, I quietly give thanks for something both very small and very immense. I am still alive. And now I know why. At 67, I am no longer seeking revenge. I seek stillness. I seek gentle breaths. I seek ways to honor the man who gave up everything to keep me safe. And I honor him by living without fear, living without hatred, living without chains. Because after all that pain, at last, I finally deserve to rest. 6 months after Andre died, spring returned quietly to Cleveland. The trees in West Boulevard Park began to bud. Children ran and played with bright laughter. Life went on in its usual way, indifferent to the pain each person has to carry alone. I sat on my usual wooden bench in the park, hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee. That habit had become my morning ritual, a small ceremony of peace after too many years of chaos. I no longer lived in fear, but I didn't live in oblivion either. Every day, I still thought of Andre, not with the tearing pain of those first weeks, but with a deep, steady gratitude for what he had done. Last week, I received a letter from Callista Owens. She said she had finished the manuscript of a 400-page investigative book about the entire case, titled The Invisible Price: How One Man's Silence Bought Justice for Cleveland. She asked for my consent before publishing. I agreed, with one condition. Tell the full truth. Don't turn Andre into a perfect hero. Tell the story of a frightened man, a man who made mistakes, but who loved strongly enough to sacrifice. The book is scheduled for release in the fall. My share of the royalties will go into the fund I just established, the Andre Lomax Justice Fund, for people who have been wrongfully convicted and families crushed by corruption. It is not a way to bring Andre back, but it is a way to ensure that his death is not just a tiny news line in the Daily Bulletin, swallowed up by other stories and forgotten. One afternoon, Deshaun Miles came to visit me. He stood at the door with a large cardboard box in his hands. "What is that?" I asked as I let him in. "The last of what remains from the case," he replied. "I thought you should have it." We sat down at the small kitchen table. Deshaun opened the box carefully, as if there were something fragile inside. It held photos, copies of documents, marked envelopes, and one thing that made my throat close instantly: Andre's wedding ring. "We found it among his personal effects at the hospital," Deshaun explained. "He kept it all those years on the street. It was wrapped in a small piece of cloth, hidden close to his heart." I held the ring in my trembling hands. The metal was worn, scratched in many places, but it was still the ring from back then, a silent piece of evidence that even when he was forced to erase himself from my life, Andre had never erased his love for me. "Do you know what impressed me most about this case?" Deshaun asked after a quiet moment. "What?" "Not the scale of the corruption, not the money, but this. An ordinary man, not a hero, not a warrior, chose to sacrifice himself in silence to protect the person he loved. And a woman, after being betrayed, broken, forgotten, chose to stand up and fight to save the person who once saved her." His voice tightened slightly. "That's the kind of love the law can't measure," he continued, "but it's the kind that changed an entire city." I wiped away my tears. "He didn't just save me," I whispered. "He also saved himself by allowing the truth to be spoken, even if it was too late for him to enjoy it." Deshaun nodded. "And you saved him," he said, "by making sure his sacrifice wasn't buried with him." If you are still listening to me now, you might be asking yourself, after all of that, do I have regrets? Have I ever thought that if I had stayed still, hadn't dug into anything, maybe Andre could have lived a few more months, a few more years, in quiet? The answer to that? I had to face it in front of hundreds of strangers, and at that moment, I understood exactly what I had truly chosen. A month later, I received an invitation from Cleveland State University. They wanted me to speak to law students about the case. At first, I refused. "I'm not a speaker," I told the coordinator. "I'm just a woman who was lucky to survive." But Callista persuaded me, "Exactly because you're not a lawyer, not a journalist, not a politician. Your story carries weight. You're an ordinary person who faced an extraordinary system and still stood." So I went. The lecture hall was packed. More than 200 students, professors, and even a few survivors from other corruption cases were there. I stood behind the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces, and for the first time in months, I felt afraid again. Not afraid of threats, but afraid I wouldn't be able to say what mattered most. I began with a simple truth. My name is Sharon Delacroix. I'm 67 years old, and until 6 months ago, I had no idea that the husband who left me had actually saved my life. The room fell completely silent. I told the story, not in legal language, but in raw emotions, the betrayal, the hatred, the years of hunger and humiliation, then the day the truth cracked open, the new rage, and finally, the understanding. "What I learned," I said, my voice a little shaky, "is that corruption doesn't just steal money, it steals lives. It steals hope. It steals the future of people who don't even know they've been targeted." I looked down at the row of students in the front. Some of you will become lawyers, some will become judges, some will work in government, and one day you will stand before a choice: silence or speaking out, safety or truth. I paused for a beat. I can't tell you what to choose, but I can tell you this: silence always has a price, and more often than not, the ones who pay are not you, but the people you love, the people you never thought would be hurt. When I finished, a young woman in the audience raised her hand. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Stirring everything up? Because maybe if you hadn't done anything, he could have lived longer, more peacefully?" That is exactly the question I asked myself every night. I took a deep breath. "Yes," I said honestly. There are nights I lie awake and wonder if I killed him with my stubbornness. But then I remember the look in Andre's eyes when he heard they'd been arrested. His smile when he knew his name was cleared. Tears filled my eyes, but I did not turn away. He didn't die in peace because he was left alone, I said. He died in peace because finally he was seen, known, understood. And for a man who had lived like a ghost for 15 years, that feeling might be worth far more than a few extra months or years of quiet. When summer came, I planted a small garden on my balcony. A few pots of tomatoes, some basil, a clump of lavender. Small things, but they brought real joy. One morning, while watering the plants, I suddenly stopped and asked myself, what has really changed? That corrupt network had collapsed. Elias Bradford was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Marvin Duquesne got 15 and was stripped of all public offices. Over 30 other officials, contractors, and lawyers were prosecuted. The city of Cleveland was forced to change. New bidding procedures were tightened. Independent oversight bodies were created. Journalists like Callista were honored for their investigative work. And I had changed too. I was no longer the woman the world had discarded. I was the woman who stepped forward and didn't break. But victory doesn't mean there is no more pain. Every day, I still remember Andre. Every day, I still wonder, could we have had a different ending? Even so, deep down, I know we had no other choice. The truth had to be spoken, no matter how high the price. That night, I opened the journal Callista told me to keep. She had said, "Writing it down will help you process everything, and one day, it might help someone else." I sat at the table, picked up a pen, and wrote, "What I learned from Andre. Sometimes love looks like betrayal, when it is forced to protect by disappearing. True sacrifice often happens in silence, without recognition, without thanks, only with the hope that the one you love will live. Justice that arrives late is still justice, but it can never repay the years that were stolen. Systems can be bent, can be manipulated, but they can also be broken if ordinary people choose courage over safety. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the past control the future. And most importantly, surviving is not enough. You must live in a way that is worthy by honoring those who sacrificed so you could still be here." I closed the notebook and looked out the window. The streetlights had just come on. The city was stepping into another night. Somewhere out there are still people living in silence, people forced to choose between truth and survival, people carrying the guilt meant for someone more powerful. My story and Andre's is not unique. It's just one of countless stories buried every year. But at least one story has been told. At least one truth has been exposed. At least one man has been cleared. And one woman, after all the years of being broken, has finally found peace. Not because everything has been fixed, but because at last, everything has been understood. Today, when I look back at all that has happened, I do not regret the choice I made. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. Andre taught me that sometimes the greatest love is the kind no one sees, the kind that sacrifices in the dark so someone else can live in the light. And I have taught myself that it is never too late to fight for the truth, even if you are 67, tired, and have already lost too much. Because justice is not about age, it is about courage. If you are hearing this and living in silence, out of fear, pressure, or the belief that no one will believe you, know this: your voice matters, your truth matters, and you are not alone. There are people like me, like Callista, like Deshawn, people who will stand with you when you are ready to stand up. Don't let someone else decide how your story ends. Be the one who writes the final chapter. I am Sharon Delacroix, and this is the story I chose to tell, not because it is easy, but because it needed to be told. Thank you for listening.